Okay, another one of these book things. I'm not quite sure why I do these, but for whatever reason I do. This is Stephen Ambrose's Nothing Like It in the World. Now, I read one of his more a contemporaneous book, one that he did a little before this, Undaunted Courage. I've had that for a while, and I enjoyed that a lot. I picked it up, I think here, and it was quite on my first iteration here, probably. And it was kind of exciting because I had just recently, within a year or so, gone on a trip throughout the entire Pacific Northwest before I moved here the first time. And a lot of the locations that are mentioned in the book are places that we visited along that trip, including jumping in the river that was apparently terrifying to them. It wasn't too terrifying to anyone who could swim. A little dangerous, but not bad at all, and I've read that a couple of times and enjoyed that. But I had thought that I had read other stuff by Ambrose. I look at the cover here, they give a few citizen soldiers. Maybe that may have been an American Civil War one. Undaunted Courage, which, yes, and D-Day. And what's not listed here is Band of Brothers, which is, of course, a name that's familiar to me, but I don't think I read it. So I'm a little confused, and I looked on his wiki page, which is where I found Band of Brothers on there. And also, again, I don't see anything that I really recognize other than this in Undaunted Courage. Anyway, this is about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, focusing on the two big railways, the UP and the CP. The CP not being the Canadian Pacific, which is what I'm used to being, the CP, but rather the Central Pacific, which eventually kind of helped create and then merged into the Southern Pacific. And then eventually in the 1990s, they all merged together under the UP. I've known some things about the creation of, especially the UP and the Credit Mobilier fiasco, scandal, whatever you want to say, before. But his reason for writing this is an interesting one. It's that no one actually really went into the details of the actual building of the railways, as opposed to, say, the financing of them or the scandals surrounding the financing of them. And so this is, kind of interesting. A lot of information I didn't know. In particular, a couple of the people who sort of first laid out the idea, not necessarily the idea for a transcontinental railway, but it looks at all of the big names and people who were involved in it. And in this case, General Dodge, whom I assume Dodge City was named after, who wasn't a general when he first started being involved in this. He was a railway man who eventually got promoted into the Army and became sort of Sherman's protege in a lot of ways. And then, after the Civil War, kind of resisted being called back into railway duty, even though, he had been heavily involved already prior to the Civil War in terms of laying out the route from Omaha westward. And then Theodore Judah, who was in California and was proposing the route forward and scouted out a lot of it, again, well previous to when it was done. And both Dodge and Judah did a lot of effort towards getting congressional and federal approval and ways in which this could be financed, passed, or at least on politicians' horizon, as it were, as to, you know, how this could actually be done and how the government could support it and how important it was. Lincoln was a big proponent of it. Like I said, Sherman was a huge proponent of it, and in fact, within the Army context, saw it as this huge advantage for the Army, which it ended up being. It ended up saving the Army, you know, amounts of money that, given the actual cash that the government put up in funding, which was all done via loans, basically government-backed bonds for the corporations based on the track that they laid. So in terms of financing, the corporations got a number of different things. One is they got the land grants, which is often seen, you know, that was the biggest funding swath for them, but that didn't really cost the government anything. As you can see, you know, if you look at land that the government had, most of that land out west was never of any value anyway, and ended up, well, in terms of commercial value and whatnot, and it ended up a lot of it becoming part of the national park system. So a lot of the land that they gave, especially going through the Rockies, wasn't going to be worth shit without a railway being completed. And then where land was perhaps more valuable or more potentially valuable prior to this construction effort, still without a railroad going through the area, it was virtually worthless anyhow. And the government owned land skyrocketed in value, even though they gave a lot to the railways. It was also supremely beneficial to the government on that side. This really looks into the laying out of the paths, the kind of work that was necessary to actually, you know, grade the tracks and to meet the requirements that the government had in terms of, like, you know, the grade that you were allowed, which in some ways, especially going through the Sierra Nevada, ended up causing some serious difficulties, changes to what Judah's original plans were, which involved steeper switchbacks. Well, the switchbacks were no good because of the sharpness of the curves that were required. The government said, yeah, we demand this set. And that necessitated greater fills, bridges, blasting tunnels. And a lot of this is sort of, you know, you can find some of the information somewhere or another, but this really consolidates everything together. Now, it also incorporates some of the financials into it, as well as, you know, the efforts that were required to ship, you know, all the iron had to be produced in the U.S., as one example, which was particularly problematic for the West Coast terminus of the railway, building the Central Pacific eastward, because essentially all that rail and all the locomotives and everything had to be shipped around South America or else pushed through the Isthmus of Panama. All of which ended up very, very expensive in terms of moving the materials there. And then it, you know, it goes into the men who were involved in making the railways a reality not just, Dodge and Judah, but the four big movers in California who were already established businessmen there, probably the biggest name out of them all being Stanford. The others, Crocker was very, very big on this and was very much involved in the actual building side of things. He was sort of there. Huntington was sent to the east to raise money, where he had contacts there, and having trouble remembering. Hopkins was the fourth one, who was dealing with moving materials and getting them to Crocker. Over on the UP side, the guy who was probably most involved was this dude, Doc Durant. And he's the one who came up with the Credit Mobilier scheme. Now, what's odd is the CP side of things performed a very similar type of shell game in terms of, okay, we're going to build this huge railway, but we're going to take money out of this. We're going to be able to get subscriptions and people will buy stocks in the railroad because they want the railroad there. But if we want to make money off of it, what we need to do is create essentially a contracting company and divert all the cash flow through that contracting company, use subcontractors, whatever we need to do, buy the materials and everything, but just take a skim off the top. Now, for the people who were involved in the investment, and Durant managed to get a lot of money from the Ames brothers, Oak Ames, and I don't remember the other one, who were already very wealthy, through both subscribing to the UP stocks, but more importantly for their own wealth, subscribing to Credit Mobilier. And likewise, the CP side of things, and I don't remember the name of the company, I think it was like Stanford and Crocker Construction or something like that. But the four men who were most involved in that basically owned the vast majority of that, and a few of the key movers and shakers on the UP side owned the initial Credit Mobilier stock. Now, what was kind of fucked up, Credit Mobilier ended up giving out shares to congressmen and whatnot to make sure things passed. What they didn't do was subscribe it the same way they subscribed the UP stock, trying to get, the towns along the way. Not that there were many. Really, there was only one big town that was between, say, Omaha and where you kind of hit the Sierra Nevadas with the CP, even though the UP never really went up that way. The CP raced and got quite far distance-wise, given how difficult the terrain they had to travel to reach Promontory, where they connected the two, with the big golden spike. And by the way, if you're interested in games and whatnot, Silverton doesn't really handle the full, it doesn't really cover the whole story. In fact, it doesn't cover any of the story realistically, but it does have some spike type scenarios where you're running companies on one side of the connection and companies on the other side, and they're delivering goods, and the markets are influenced very heavily by what goods are available and whatnot. That's all based on Colorado railroading and really has little to do with this, if anything, except the concept of a spike being put in. But anyway, but it's a really cool game, and I suggest that to anybody who wants to look into something kind of like that. And I did videos on that a long, long time ago. I am sure that there are others in terms of the railroad, in terms of the computer games. I do Railroad Tycoon for this kind of feel. that has more of an 18xx feeling to it, with competition for shares and stuff like that, and to take over one another's companies more than just to be investors in them. Although you can invest in a good, powerful company, but what ends up happening is if they're doing better than you, in which case you may not want to be invested in them, except that they provide a return on your excess cash, you end up losing to them anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, there was my tangent about gaming. But yeah, the Credit Mobilier ended up getting a lot of negative attention drawn to it. Now the CP was doing something very, very similar. The big four were invested in that. For the UP also, Brigham Young was invested heavily with the Salt Lake City connection, which is why I diverted and then got all confused in terms of where I'm going with everything, because that's what I do, right? Everything's a tangent for me. But, and Young contributed a lot of Mormons, or energized a lot of Mormons about building the railway to try to get it through. Now, it wouldn't go through Salt Lake City itself, it went north of the lake, although eventually cutting through the lake became possible. But that well outside the time period of this. But yeah, the California Big Four ended up creating something very much like Credit Mobilier and siphoning off a lot of the money that was going into the CP into their own little dirty pockets. You get the feeling that they were, honestly, everybody in the book is more or less presented as wanting to build a railroad and wanting to make money off doing so. And making the money off doing so was very questionable if their stock was getting all watered down. So the idea of like creating this little weird shell that was siphoning money off of the construction costs was very attractive. The thing with the CP's sort of shadow company was that all their records were accidentally destroyed. So Credit Mobilier actually took more heat because they didn't have their records disappear on them. And exactly what was happening and how the money was being funneled was more disturbing when it came to light. Whereas the CP's shadow, everybody knew that they were ripping it off, but it wasn't, there wasn't the smoking gun in the same way. Now, part of the reason there was a smoking gun was that this whole shell game thing with the UP was really like this Dr. Ant guy's brainstorm. And he got his biggest, best, most important investors, people like the Ameses, to invest in the Credit Mobilier. And also it was used as a pot sweetener for politicians and whatnot. And it ended up paying ridiculous levels of profit out. I have a game on Credit Mobilier, but it doesn't feel like a good simulation. I played that as well. I picked that up because I was so excited, to have a game about this swindling type of deal here, and it just ended up feeling like a Euro as far as I remember. I don't have much memory of it at all, except that it sure the hell wasn't the thing that I hoped it would be. I don't know what I wanted it to be, but I wanted something that would like really capture the flavor of this attempt to divert money out of railways into personal pocket. The 18xx games really show that nicely. Not in the explicit sense of something like Credit Mobilier, where essentially the money was just being raked down. It was just being scooped out of the corporate treasures. The corporations were both very, very close to bankruptcy. The UP, in fact, went insolvent. And out of all people, it was Fisk, one of the Fisk and Gould were the two who were involved in the Erie, equally despicable financial manipulation. It was Fisk, and I don't remember his first name, who actually managed to get Durant ousted, investigated and ousted from the company. And Durant ended up not having a hell of a lot of money after it, but mainly because he made some really poor investments afterwards. He and the Ameses were raking money in, and all the senators they were bribing and congressmen that they were bribing with these shares. I thought Credit Mobilier actually ended up as something of a bubble. There's no discussion of that in here. So I don't know, but I know that there was a major depression soon after this period, and that may have wiped out a lot of those gains. One thing it did was it made the railways really, really suspect after this all came out. And it's kind of weird because the railroad companies were viewed with a very positive light, and especially the transcontinentals after they connected things up. In one sense, I gotta swap batteries, hold on. Okay, I'll not go with the thought I was gonna go with because it kind of branches a little further. Because I wanted to get this in as well. After the UP kind of went into receivership, essentially. The historian Charles Adams, who was one of the people who really was kind of clanging alarm bells about it, was one of the presidents of the UP. And then, not Fisk, but Jay Gould was one of the presidents as well, which is just kind of amusing at that. The CP managed to kind of keep a low profile and not get into the same kind of trouble, even though they did many of the same things as far as Ambrose can tell. One of the things that Ambrose brings out is not only that there was nothing like it in the world, in the sense that no one had built a railway of anything like this kind of size before anywhere. In fact, until the Trans-Siberian Railway later, there really wasn't anything like it. And that was much, much slower and was funded by the government entirely and had its own issues. But one of the big points that he brings out is that basically both America and the world sort of changed during this period so heavily. Now, the telegraph existed already, but what you had, you didn't have a contiguous telegraph network going all the way to the West Coast until the railway was built. So you basically had this combination of a trip that took months to transit, whether by sea or directly by land, which took even longer, to transit North America, changed to a week or two, which seems kind of heavy now with air traffic, but the trains weren't that much slower than our trains are now, all things given, especially since our current passenger trains often get shunted off onto a siding because there's a freight train that needs to get through instead. It's just to show, how we really haven't advanced all that much in a lot of ways. But even more astounding, because the telegraph getting hooked up, you had virtually instantaneous communications across the continent, where before, in order to get information through, you had like the Wells Fargo stagecoaches carrying the mail through and whatnot. Yeah. As well as money that could be robbed. Of course, trains could be robbed too. But what about the book itself? Well, obviously a significant amount of research went into this. That it's very clear, and it's properly annotated and everything. There's a notes section and all that gives us all the citations and everything. Ambrose is a serious historian, even though he's a popularizer of history as well. There are quite a few such. I'm not going to hold him out as anybody specific, but I find something very enjoyable about the more popularized, well-written histories, and I think he does a very good job of that kind of thing. He doesn't speculate too much. He doesn't add all kinds of... He doesn't add his speculations outside of an editorializing comment of some sort or something along that line. So you're not being fed a bunch of bullshit that is just his imagination or anything like that, which some of the earlier popularizers have done. I feel like history in general has gotten much, much better in that sort of way. Since I don't know, the early part of the 20th century, I think still histories were kind of iffy. You read them and you're like, and certainly you don't really feel like he terribly has an axe to grind or anything, where there is no information, something like, say, the CP records being destroyed. He doesn't really, go too far into how terrible that is. So the only thing he can say is, look, they probably were, as far as we can tell, they were doing the same kind of stuff the UP was doing in a lot of ways. It's just there wasn't any proof of it. They were smart enough to have had a terrible accident happen. I also find his writing enjoyable and easy reading, which is in contrast to something else I've been reading, which I brought up recently during my DAC game for whatever reason, which is, I think it's The Heart of Europe or something like that. It's about, it's about the Holy Roman Empire, but I just found it so hard to work through. It's not like it was hard reading or anything. I just couldn't piece everything together. Whereas this, everything kind of sticks together, and I've got a contiguous story. Even if some segments are pulled out and not discussed as fully throughout, there's sort of a linkage between different concepts. So if there was a financial element that applied during that time and was having an impact, even though we weren't in the finances at a particular time, it would be mentioned. And it might get brought up later in another chapter, but it all links together and fits together in a way that I could get the whole story. Of course, this is also only 6 years, 1863 to 1869, without a lot of different personalities and without a lot of chaos. Whereas the Holy Roman Empire is, running, I don't remember where he started it, I think he started it with Charlemagne, to be honest, but certainly the focus of the book is more from Ottonian onward. But, you're talking about centuries of really, really chaotic and very different types of structures happening within the empire. And that really just wasn't the book I was looking for. I wanted something that would give me sort of a solid story that I could conceivably make a game from. This is not something I would want to make a game from because the focus is on the building of the railways, which, it's interesting. You'll see that I play railroad games sometimes that are more about construction type elements and whatnot, but my real taste for it would be more in trying to pull over a fast one with with the financial side of things. So there might be other books that might help me come to some idea for a game of that nature. Or a broader picture, which includes the running of the railways and whatnot. There are plenty out there that work perfectly fine. What's not out there, as far as I know, outside of Railroad Tycoon, is something that allows you to really, in detail, help develop industries and whatnot, and make the connections that work well there. I feel like I'm sinking too much into details that I'm less interested in, though, in Railroad Tycoon, because you have to pay too much attention to, like, are your trains becoming obsolete? Do you have to, like, replace them? Have your routes changed? Do you have trains stuck somewhere because some resources aren't being collected up? And that's the kind of thing I don't want to pay that much attention to, and I feel like the game gets too big in that sense, although I've been thinking about playing that on the computer in an attempt to get away from Raid. Overall, I enjoyed this. I don't think I'm going to keep it. I just don't think I have room to read this again in the time of my lifespan, given the amount of books that I have available to me right now. If I hadn't, if I didn't have this huge swath of books, I would keep it. If I was in the position I was in Phoenix or whatever, where there weren't little free libraries everywhere, I would keep this because it was an enjoyable read and I would enjoy reading it again. But I think I've gotten most of the story that I want out of it, and again, I don't feel like I'm going to use it as a reference for anything that I'm going to try to do with it. So it'll go back out there. I'm debating whether or not I want to reread at any point the Undaunted Courage. I've seen other copies of it floating around in the little free library system, so I'm less inclined to put my copy out there because I know people who want it are able to get a hold of it and whatnot. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed this. I started reading this during my power blackout, which just gives you an idea of how long it takes me to read something now. During that period, I got through quite a bit of it because there wasn't much else to do, reading by candlelight and whatnot. And then, after that, with my time being able to listen to videos and do all kind of other stuff, I kind of just ended up becoming a bathroom book like most of my books do, which means, I read on the crapper and in the tub, and that's about it. Which is a shame because I really do like reading, and this was enjoyable. I probably would have gotten through this in a week if I was my old self. But nowadays, I just don't read the way I used to. And I enjoy reading more than I enjoy playing Raid and watching videos. But I don't always do. I enjoy walking more than those as well. And I just don't do the things that I enjoy as much as the things which help keep the mind from engaging on anything. So there you have it. Cheers.